Yeah, actually, my favorite talk that I ever gave here, besides doing my testimony, was when I talked about a chapter that I wrote in a book called The Story of the Cosmos, and it was a chapter called God, Black Holes, and the End of the Universe. So if you want something that I think is really representative of my work here, that's the one. Okay, so today, okay, good, we've got the thing up there, talking about proof of God's existence. I guess it was a couple of years ago that I gave the teaser for this talk, which was, if you had proof of God's existence, what would you do with that? You know, how would you live your life? Are there any changes that you would make? And so this was the promised second part of that. And one reason it took so long is that for a long time I've been working on a book. It's about 80% done. This is the key chapter in the book, and I just thought, you know, I want to wait until the book comes out before I present on this, but I just got so exhausted with the process of writing that book, and also I went back to teaching, and it's really tiring, doing a lot of teaching, and so I thought, you know what, I'll just throw this out there, and when the book comes out, the book comes out, it's fine. So it was just time to go ahead and do this. And let me see if I can do this the right way. Okay, so if God exists, why doesn't he give us proof? This is something that atheists and seekers have asked me many times, and you know, it's an understandable question. There are people who really struggle with the evidence, and what I like to tell them is that God did give us proof, and if anyone has read the Bible, you've actually seen that proof, though you may not recognize it. So I want to take you through that step by step. But first of all, let's talk about the different types of proof, because people get a little confused about what that means. There's mathematical proofs. If any of you have ever taken math in college, you might, or even if you took high school geometry, you have these deductive arguments where you have some premises or assumptions, and then you just show logically how you arrive at a conclusion. Like if A equals B and B equals C, then you know that A equals C. That just logically flows. That's a proof. Okay. Philosophical proofs work in a similar way. You have a deductive argument that flows from the premises. And so since this is a reasonable faith chapter, it's a great opportunity to point out one of Dr. William Lane Craig's most famous ideas, which is the Kalam cosmological argument. That is a philosophical proof, and it goes like this. Everything that exists, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So that would be a philosophical type proof. Now, the one usually that skeptical people are asking for is a scientific proof. And as a scientist, I'm here to tell you there's no such thing as a scientific proof. That's not what science is in the business of doing. Science tests hypotheses. It'll ask a question. It tries to explain natural phenomena. The best we can ever do is to come up with a really, really good explanation that so far has passed all of the observational experimental tests we can throw at it and doesn't have any serious evidence against it. But we never arrive at the point of proof. So you say, well, there are certain things in science that are facts, like the fact is that there's a planet called Earth and we're existing on it. That's a fact. But that's not a hypothesis, that's not a theory, that's not something that you would prove with a scientific type study. Okay, we're talking about more things like theories of gravity and electromagnetism, okay? So there's no such thing as a scientific proof. So more what I'm interested in here, and I think this is more relevant to what I'm talking about, is a jurisprudence type proof, okay? And you've probably heard the phrase, the burden of proof, and in law, and sometimes in philosophy, they say, well, whoever makes the claim has the burden of proof, meaning you got to demonstrate that this claim is true. So when we talk about this, usually, and this would be in the context of like a criminal case in court, that you would have to show that somebody is guilty beyond any reasonable doubt in order to get a conviction, right? So cold case Christianity, if any of you have heard of that, it's a ministry by my friend J. Warner Wallace. He is a former cold case homicide detective from Los Angeles, and he has a whole ministry built around this type of thing, making cases, right, and showing using all types of evidence, how you build a case. And so this is the type of thing I'm talking about, what it would take to remove all reasonable doubt that God exists. Okay, so let me pivot here a little bit, and this is going to relate to what I'm talking about. What evidence would convince you that someone had cheated on the lottery? Okay, so just think about that for a moment. Something really big like the Powerball, hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Which is kind of interesting. When I was a kid, and I actually briefly worked for the British Columbia Lottery Corporation. I grew up in Canada in my 20s, and they did not have these humongous jackpots that they have here in the United States. I mean, we thought that, you know, like $20 million was huge. I never saw anything like these hundreds of millions of dollars that they have here. But it's relevant to what we're talking about. So let's just imagine if you knew somebody personally who had won the Powerball jackpot, let's say a few $100 million, right? Okay, I mean, that's a pretty rare thing. The odds of winning the Powerball are almost 1 in 300 million. Okay, yeah, it's not zero, but it would be a pretty rare thing for you to personally know someone who won the Powerball. But I'm pretty sure if you did know someone, you wouldn't immediately think, oh, that person cheated, right? You just think, wow, that lucky guy, I hate him. But maybe you'd hope to get in on his good graces or something. But, you know, fair enough. Somebody won. People win. They win. You know, every year we get winners. Okay. The odds are low, very low, but it's possible. Now, just to put this in perspective, right? The odds are really low. Now, air travel, as much as I hate it, I have to admit, as a mathematical type person, that it is by far the safest way to travel. The odds are incredibly low that you would ever die in a plane crash, and yet you are 27 times more likely to die in a plane crash than you are to win the Powerball. You're 80 times more likely to die of a shark attack than you are to win the Powerball. Again, extremely few people have died of shark attacks, especially in Austin. And you are 1,500 times more likely to die being struck by lightning than you are to win the Powerball. Now, most people, when they see lightning, especially if it's close, they take reasonable precautions, but I don't know a lot of people who are freaked out about dying by a lightning strike, right? It's just because we know that the odds of that happening are so incredibly low. And we know that the odds of winning the Powerball are much, much lower. Okay, this is just to put things in perspective. Now, what if you knew someone who won the Powerball twice? At that point, you're like, I don't know about this, okay? So it's deeply suspicious. Not only that, at this point, this person's going to get a knock on the door by the feds. Now, why though? I mean, if you think about why, just purely based on the fact that somebody's got 2 winning tickets, one from one jackpot, one from another, that's all the evidence you've got. That's all the evidence anyone would need to say something kind of fishy went on there, right? Okay. Now, what if you knew someone who won the Powerball 3 times in a row? 3 times, all right? At that point, could anyone say that it's beyond, you know, that there's any doubt whatsoever that this person has rigged the system? There's some cheating that's going on here, right? Okay, and you know that purely mathematically. No other evidence. You don't have evidence of him sneaking into wherever the system is. You don't have any sort of that evidence. You would know just mathematically that person somehow cheated. Okay, let's keep this in mind. So this poor surprised looking guy, this actually relates to something that I read about because I was curious, has anyone ever actually been caught cheating the lottery? And the answer is yes, this guy, his name is Eddie Tipton, and about 10 years ago, he got in a little bit of trouble. So here's the problem. He won the $16 million jackpot, whatever state he was in. Okay, well, you know, people win. And $16 million, I'm sorry to say, doesn't seem like a huge amount of money to people anymore. But he won the lottery nonetheless. And so you think, okay, what's the big deal? The problem is that he worked for the Iowa State lottery system. Okay? He had access to the system. He was a programmer. So, I mean, what was this guy thinking? And That was all the evidence anyone needed. I mean, just your reaction right here says it all, right? What are the odds that somebody with access to the lottery system would also win the jackpot? Okay, and there's his poor lawyer there. It's just, the story just writes itself. And what happened is that he was clever, right? He was a clever programmer. He used something called a rootkit. I don't know if any of you here are computer people, but this is a little program that you can just slip into a system. It does its thing, and then it deletes itself so that there is no evidence that that thing ever existed in the system. Very clever, okay? And what he did is this rootkit, it made it inevitable that a certain set of numbers would be drawn by the system, which this huge system, very complex, is supposed to come up with totally random numbers, right? But he told it, I want these numbers to come up. And so he knew ahead of time, he played the numbers, and he won. But now you have to remember, there was no evidence. Nobody saw him sneaking in there. There wasn't any leftover code, right? What the prosecutor told the jury is you don't need to know how any of this works. Just the sheer improbability that somebody who works for the state lottery system would win the jackpot is enough. And they convicted him. That was enough to convict him. Okay? I don't think, and he finally just fessed up anyway. I mean, it's just, that was it. Now, this guy, you know, and that's not the end of the story. Here's the problem. Okay. So it turns out that his brother had won the Colorado lottery sometime before that. This all starts to come to light. A friend of his won the Oklahoma lottery. Another friend won the Wisconsin lottery. And some more friends won smaller amounts in the Kansas lottery. Now, the system that he worked for was a state system that oversaw the lotteries in several other states. So again, what are the odds that all of these people, at least 6 people, 5, 6 people, that are connected to this guy who works for the lottery system are going to win these big amounts, right? He got convicted again, okay? And I think he got sentenced for something like 25 years. I don't know if he's out yet, but I mean, that's it. The sheer improbability, the coincidences. They didn't need to know how he did it. They just, based on the improbability, his goose was cooked. Okay. Now this will come back later to what we're talking about here. So let's shift over to talking about one of my favorite topics, which is Genesis 1. This is actually how I came to belief. I encourage you to read or to look at the video of my testimony about how I went from atheism to Christianity, but it was largely through Genesis 1, which we all know is the story of creation, of how God created the world. And I contend that it has many layers of meaning. Those of you who've studied it know that on one level, it appears to be just a very straightforward, God did this, here's how he developed the universe, but there's a lot more meaning there too. So it's a narrative about God's work in making the natural world. And I like this 2 books view. So other people have said this, but I think it's widely attributed to Francis Bacon, who's considered the father of the scientific method. And he said that there are 2 books. God wrote 2 books. One, of course, is the book of Scripture, which is the special revelation about God's interaction in the world, Jesus coming into the world to save us. But the other book that God wrote is the book of nature, and we just see it all around us. Okay, so I really like that. Now, I also contend that Genesis is not allegorical, okay? So I think that Genesis is literal history, among other things. Okay, so coming from this perspective. Now, Dr. William Lane Craig likes to call it mytho-history. So he has a slightly different take on this, and you can check out, he's got videos and articles about this, but I contend that it is actual literal history. Okay, so the idea is if that God wrote both of these books, they should agree with each other, right? Because God is consistent, he doesn't contradict himself. So I believe very much that these books should agree with each other. We can learn a lot from fitting these 2 books to each other. And one other thing I liked is, I love this quote. So Dr. Pony, he's a good friend of mine. I've known him ever since I used to work at UT. I think he's a great guy. He's got a lot of interesting perspectives on Genesis in particular, coming from, if you remember his perspective as a biologist, he went to seminary. He reads Hebrew, he reads Greek, it's amazing. But what he likes to tell people who are skeptical of trying to fit together natural phenomena with what the Bible says, is, well, you look at these things in Genesis and they make statements, right? That God did this and God did that. And he said, well, imagine if you were there. What did that actually look like? It had to look like something. It wasn't magic, right? So you have to put yourself there and think, what did this actually look like? So there must be some record in the natural order of things that we can investigate. Okay, so, and the good thing here is that Genesis 1 makes actual specific claims. And these are claims that we can test. I've counted 27. I encourage you to look through Genesis 1 and see if you count the same number that I do. And I've highlighted here with these arrows a few of these very specific testable statements. And I think we can learn a lot by comparing how well they agree with the natural record. And this is a very biblical idea too. I mean, Paul told us to do this. He said in 1 Thessalonians, test all things, hold fast what is good. And he's talking about Scripture. He's not saying just have blind faith. He's saying test it, you know. And if you have the courage to do that, I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised at some of the things that you learn. Okay, so what I want to do at this point is go through a semi-exhaustive list of Genesis 1 versus the natural record. And in fact, I had to bring notes for this, and I think this will kind of be an attestation to some of the points I'm making here. This is from a chapter of the book that I wrote, which hopefully will come out someday, but this is so detailed that I've got to have my crib sheet with me here. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at each of these 27 testable statements. I'll state how it's stated in Scripture, and then we'll compare with what science says about the same thing, okay? So the very first statement of the Bible, in the beginning, and I've got the number there in the brackets, will tell you that'll keep count. Okay, well, in science, I've got the scientific statements in orange. Everything in our universe, space, time, and energy had a beginning, okay? So this is the Big Bang model of the universe. This is something that we've known about, at least deeply suspected, for the last 100 years. This began with Hubble's discovery that galaxies in the universe are all moving away from each other, that the universe is expanding. And then the evidence just kept mounting after that until the 1960s, when the cosmic background radiation was discovered, and that was pretty much it for any idea of the universe just being eternal. We knew that the universe had a beginning. So far, so good. The next statement, God created heaven and earth. Well, when you listen to physicists talking about the universe, about the Big Bang, they'll say, when the universe was created. Okay, so it was brought about through an act of creation. Okay, Genesis 1:2, the earth was without form. Now initially, if you look back in the early history of the universe, there were no structures. So I think a lot of people don't understand that immediately after the Big Bang, there was just this incredibly hot plasma of energy. So first you have energy, and then you get matter forming. It's just this hot plasma of quarks and gluons. No structure at all, nothing, okay? So including Earth, nothing was there except for energy and some matter. Empty. So there was initially no matter in the universe. I think that surprises a lot of people. In the very beginning of the universe, just after the Big Bang, all you've got is energy. That energy eventually becomes matter through E = mc squared, but initially, no matter at all. With darkness on the face of the depths. And this is really neat. In fact, physicists refer to what is called the cosmic dark ages Initially, the universe was incredibly dark, okay? So far, things are matching up pretty well. We've got 5 statements here. Genesis 1:2, God's Spirit moved on the water's surface. Now, science says that something unique happened early in the development of the universe, something called cosmic inflation, if any of you have heard of that. Now, this is the only passage, this is the only event of the 27 that both in terms of theology and the science, it's not really that settled, okay? Theologians have debated what this means. And if you look at the word that's used for God's Spirit, the Hebrew word is ruach, okay? And if any of you have ever studied that, you know that it means like a wind, okay? An exhalation, that kind of thing. It can also mean a very violent exhalation, like of air or something, okay? So what's interesting here is that cosmic inflation is a period that physicists have posited happened extremely early in the history of the universe, where all of a sudden, apropos of nothing, you get the universe expanding at an exponential rate. So it goes from the size of about an atom to about 10,000 light years across in a matter of a fraction of a second. That is incredible. That is some kind of outburst of energy we don't quite understand. Inflation hasn't been very well supported yet. We're looking for evidence for it. It's a great idea that solves a number of problems in physics, which is why a lot of physicists want it to be true. But I just find the juxtaposition here very interesting. We're talking about a violent exhalation, God doing something. This is very unique in Scripture, nothing like it appears anywhere else. But this is also, we're talking about the sequence of events when physics posits that something very unique one time occurred, and I think they match pretty well. So that's the only one that's a bit speculative there. Okay, God said, there shall be light, and light came into existence. This is our 7th statement. After inflation, light, radiation, became the dominant substance in the universe. So there's all these different eras, okay, in Big Bang cosmology. At different points in the development of the universe, different types of substances become the dominant form of stuff in the universe, okay? And at this point, light or radiation is the dominant stuff in the universe. This corresponds to when God says, there shall be light. Okay, God divided between the light and the darkness. This is one of my favorite statements in Genesis because it's saying that darkness is something in and of itself. It's not merely the absence of light in this case. It's a thing, right? And physics very much agrees with this. You don't divide something from nothing, right? You divide between something and something. It's saying that darkness is something. And physics tells us also that there are dark things. There's dark matter. There's dark energy. And the evidence for that is a whole separate discussion, but it's really a very conventional part of physics now, that you have these unseen dark substances that are extremely important for the development of the universe. Genesis 1:6, God said, there shall be a sky in the middle of the water, and it shall divide between water and water. This is another passage that confuses people, and there's a couple of things I can say here that might help. Now, the first is the word water. So we've got mayim and shemayim in Hebrew. It's actually interesting, a plural word. Now, what you have to remember is that Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, had a very limited lexicon. We're talking a few thousand words. You compare that to modern English with hundreds of thousands of words. We have very specific words. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and as she's growing up and she's asking, why are there so many words for the same thing? And I try to tell her, it's because they express nuance, right? Like, you might want to say chartreuse instead of green because it just captures it a little bit better, right? But ancient Hebrew didn't have room for that kind of subtlety. It had very limited vocabulary. So instead of for us having 5 different ways of saying green, they had one way to say 5 different things, right? So water can also mean liquid, just a general type of liquid. It could mean any type of fluid. Okay, and what I find very interesting, and I studied Dr. Gerald Schroeder's works for a long time, and if any of you are not aware, he wrote a book called The Science of God. He's an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. He's also an MIT-trained physicist, and what I appreciate about his approach to Genesis is that he takes a very scholarly, theological approach, which includes studying the great theologians, the medieval theologians like Maimonides and Nachmanides. And what I find very interesting here particularly is that they don't seem to think that this is literally referring to H2O, okay, but rather something kind of special. So here, and I'm trying to find, okay, so Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, said, the portion above the firmament, okay, this is what this passage is referring to as the firmament, is only water in name, not in reality. The account of the firmament with that which is above it and is called water is, as you see, of a very mysterious character. And then Nachmanides, who was another Jewish sage, he refers to another sage named Rav, who says, the heavens were in a fluid form on the first day, and on the second day they solidified. The ongoing discussion in Nachmanides' commentary on Genesis shows that these early biblical scholars understood that the Bible is referring to the fluid-like substance that was initially produced in the beginning of God's creation, congealing into spherical bodies, which would be stars and planets in the heavens. Now, this was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I can't remember when Maimonides was writing, but I think Nachmanides was 700 or 800 years ago. This is long before particle physics. What I find very interesting is that in this intervening time, that physicists have figured out, using particle colliders, that the state of matter, once matter did start to form out of that energy of the Big Bang, it was initially in the form of a quark gluon plasma. So I'll explain what that is. We're made of ordinary matter. We're made of neutrons, protons, electrons, okay? Protons and neutrons, which form the nucleus of an atom, okay, they in turn are made of quarks. And that seems to be as far down as it goes, that quarks are the most fundamental state of matter that we can determine, okay? So at early times, there was so much energy. The universe was so incredibly hot, far more hot than the center of a star, that matter could only exist in a form of totally dissociated matter, right? Just these quarks, and then gluons are these particles that hold the quarks together, and that's how you get protons and neutrons, okay? It's so hot that they just existed in this soup, right? And what they determined with these particle collider experiments is that this soup, this quark gluon plasma, was a perfect fluid, okay? This was the description, amazing. They've also determined that space-time itself behaves very much as a fluid. So it seems to be that one of these types of water is of a very special nature, as Maimonides said. The other, I think as we go on, becomes apparent that it is actual H2O, which is a major constituent of the planet Earth. Very interesting. So, like, why would God is dividing between two different types of fluid, okay? God named the sky heaven. Now, at this point in the development of the universe, so you've got the bulge of our galaxy forming early on. So I wish I'd put a picture here. You guys probably know in general what a spiral galaxy looks like. The Milky Way is a spiral galaxy. These are gorgeous objects, my favorite thing in the universe. They've got kind of spherical or football-shaped spheres of stars in the center, and then they've got a flat disk. It's sort of like a softball, and then with a frisbee through the middle of it. That's the shape of a spiral galaxy, okay? The bulge formed first, okay? And then around that you get the spiral of the Milky Way forming, and that's important because our sun, we exist in the spiral part, the disk part of the Milky Way, okay? And so all of the stars that you see, if you've been lucky enough to be anywhere where it's dark, where you can see a lot of stars, which I recommend doing, it's amazing. All those thousands of stars that you see in the sky, they're all very local. They're just in the spiral disky part of the galaxy, right? So when we look up at the heavens, at the firmament, what we're seeing is the disk, okay? This is where the sun and all of the planets and the moons and everything formed, okay? So Genesis 1:9, God said, the waters under the heavens shall be gathered to one place, and dry land shall be seen. Now what we get here, and this is following a lot on Dr. Schroeder's discussion, he says if you look, the perspective of the narrative changes. At first it's the universe in general, but now that we're talking about the firmament has formed, right? The solar system is formed, we now have the earth, the narrative therefore shifts its focus to the surface of the earth. Okay, so interestingly enough, and they've found evidence recently in the Australian outback that at one time the entire earth was just covered in water. It was a water world, it was a global ocean, and that you had continents eventually appearing through the process of plate tectonics. Okay, I thought that was rather interesting. So we have this statement that at some point the waters under the heavens, talking about literal H2Os gathered into a place, and then you get the appearance of dry land. The earth wasn't formed initially with just dry land. The continents showed up later. God named the dry land earth, and the gatherings of water he named seas. We're up to statement number 12, and we do know that the various oceans and seas formed around these continents. Lots of them. Genesis 1:11, God said, the earth shall send forth vegetation. Now this is something that Marty Pony talks about, and he studied the Hebrew in depth, and he says literally what this says is that God is actually telling the earth, look earth, it's time to sprout some vegetation, okay? And it's said in a passive way, the earth shall sprout sprouts, okay? So it's not saying that God did this, it's saying God commanded the earth to do this, and then the earth did it. The first life showed up in the form of proto-vegetation, so we're talking about cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. This is the precursor to plant life. It lived by photosynthesis, turning sunlight into energy, and this eventually led to the formation of the first true plant life. Plants and fruit trees that produce their own kinds of fruits with seeds shall be on the earth. And we do see eventually that grasses, herbaceous plants, plants with seeds and fruit, which is very important, we'll come back to in a moment, after the proto-vegetation. Now, one thing that is a bit of a stumbling block for some people is the order, the sequence of events here. Now, one thing that Dr. Pony points out, which is very important, that this is a style of storytelling that has appeared elsewhere in the Bible, where the Bible says, okay, look, this thing is going to start. So it very clearly, if you look at the verbiage of the Hebrew here, it's saying, this thing is starting, this plant process is starting, and it's going to do this stuff, but we need to keep going with the story here. So we're not going to break into the story later to keep telling, oh, by the way, more plants formed. It's saying, here's the start of it, it's going to keep going and do these things. Meanwhile, we need to get back to the narrative, because the whole momentum of the narrative of Genesis is leading, of course, to the appearance of human beings, right? So it wants to just keep going to say, look, this is going to happen, we're going to keep going. Genesis 1:14, God said, there shall be lights in the heavenly sky to divide between day and night. Now, one thing that has been pointed out again, if you're looking very carefully, let me go back a little bit. If you're looking very carefully at the Hebrew and the way that the storytelling happens, it's not saying that the lights in the heavenly sky, we know that it's talking about the sun, the moon, the stars. They don't appear on this day. This is day 4. They aren't made on this day. They are becoming relevant on this day, okay? So these things would have formed on day 2 with the rest of the firmament, okay? And this is how you get plants, because you've already got the sun. You've got light that's filtering down through a very opaque atmosphere. This allows plant growth to occur. But at some point, this is very important, all this photosynthesis of this blue-green algae is producing a lot of oxygen as a waste product, okay? This is how we live in symbiosis with plant life. They need carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen as waste. We need oxygen and we produce carbon dioxide as waste, okay? So because they produce so much, we have what are called oxygen sinks on Earth. These are things that just absorb oxygen. Once those became full, scientists posit that there was something called the Great Oxidation Event, where you've now got the atmosphere being flooded with oxygen. Prior to that, it was a perfect blanket of greenhouse gases, things like methane, okay, not very conducive to human life, but a necessary part of the development of Earth, but it made the Earth's atmosphere opaque. Think about Venus, right? Venus is a good example of that. But once there was enough oxygen in the atmosphere of the Earth, the atmosphere became transparent. And so for the first time, if you happen to be on the surface of the Earth, you would be able to see things that are in outer space. You would be able to see the sun, the moon, and the stars. Before that, you would just have this hazy light whenever the sun was up. They shall be lights in the heavenly sky to shine on the earth. And so now you've got enough light reaching Earth's surface to allow a hypothetical observer. We've got God speaking about his creation from the perspective of the surface of the earth. And he's talking about, well, we've got these lights that are shining here. Now, there's a couple of reasons that this is mentioned here in the Bible. One is because look at who they're talking to. You've got the ancient Israelites. Where had they been living, right? They had been in captivity. They were in these pagan cultures that worshipped the sun and the moon as deities. And one reason that this is mentioned here, and it's mentioned seemingly out of sequence and almost in just sort of a not very, like big deal sort of way, that is trying to say, look, you guys, the sun and the moon are important, but God, created them. Look, don't worship them. They are created things. They are not gods. They are things that I made, and I put them in there in the sky for you to be of use. First of all, to illuminate the earth. It's a major source of energy for life, but it also serves as a marker of time, right? We know what time it is by the position of the sun in the sky. We know the seasons. We know we can mark months by the movement of the moon in the sky. We can navigate using the stars. So these things are really handy, but they are created things. They are not to be worshipped. So that's why they're mentioned here, but not quite in an offhand way, but just sort of like to diminish the importance that they were maybe used to seeing living in these pagan sun and moon worshiping cultures. Okay. God said the water shall teem with swarms of living creatures. Now I want to point out also here, the things that we're talking about in Genesis, all these events, you could have this entire room filled, literally filled with books talking about all of these different topics, right? The history of the universe from the Big Bang to the present day. You can have shelves and shelves of books and it wouldn't completely describe what's going on. Genesis had to encapsulate all of this in one chapter of one book, and I think it does an amazing job of distilling the really, really important highlights of all of that development. So keep that in mind. It really just has to pick out some key moments. The water shall teem with swarms of living creatures. Well, we know now that animal life appeared in the oceans, okay? That's where it first showed up. And in an amazing and so far scientifically unexplained explosion, they call this the Cambrian explosion, because you get this massive explosion of this huge variety of life, right? They don't understand why. Why did it just show up like all of the basic body plans for all of the animals that are to come showed up at that time, hundreds of millions of years ago, right? Very weird, okay? And very troubling if you're purely a materialistic person. Okay, it says that flying creatures shall fly over the land on the face of the heavenly sky. Now, let me just point out that this passage is often translated as birds shall fly over the land, right? But if you look at the Hebrew, the word is oaf. It doesn't literally mean just birds. It means flying creature, okay? So around this time, you had the development of insects. Now, the majority of insects are actually winged, and they show up rather suddenly, and they diversify very quickly, okay? And we're used to thinking of insects as a big nuisance, right? I know I do. We live in Texas. They're annoying, but they turn out to be extremely important for the development and the propagation of life, which is why they are mentioned. If they did not provide all this pollination, we would not have flowering plants from which we get a lot of our food, okay? So this is why the Bible mentions it. Okay. God thus created the great sea monsters. Genesis 1:21, we're now at the 19th statement. Okay, so this is another kind of contentious passage in the Bible talking about great sea monsters. What does it actually mean? Again, it helps to look at the Hebrew. Now you have to remember, it's kind of like some of the Christians I talk to who say, well, I believe a literal Bible. Well, I do too. But what you're reading is a translation and an interpretation. And this is something that atheists too. Well, they try to back you to court. You have to read it literally. Again, I do. But do you understand that what you're reading has been translated by teams of people over a very long period of time? If you go back, and they did the best job they could. They really did. But if you go back and you look at the Hebrew, okay, it doesn't literally say great sea monsters. You had people taking a Hebrew term that they didn't understand and trying to make the best sense of it that they could. The term is gadolim tananim, okay? So one part of that, and I need to make sure that I get this right, this is Genesis 1:21. Okay, one of those, without a doubt, means great, towering, huge, right? And I want to make sure I get the correct. Okay, gedolim. Gedolim undoubtedly means great, towering, huge. Tananim, okay, this is the plural from a word that means reptile, okay? If you look elsewhere in the Bible, in the context, and so there's one where, there's a staff that's thrown down and it becomes a tanim, a reptile, right? So Schroeder makes a case that this is actually literally saying great reptiles. Gosh, what does that sound like? So to us, it's obvious. It's like, why did they say great sea monsters instead of great reptiles? Because it made no sense to them, okay? We have to remember that dinosaurs are a relatively recent thing in our understanding, okay? So now, first of all, this corresponds to the age of the dinosaurs and also large aquatic reptiles. And in writing this chapter, because I want to get things very precise and accurate, aquatic reptiles are not actually dinosaurs. I did not know this. I grew up, dinosaur crazy, as most kids did in my generation. I always called them aquatic dinosaurs. They're just aquatic reptiles, although they look like dinosaurs, like plesiosaurs and mosasaurs. This is the time period when they would be showing up, okay? Now, the reason they didn't just say dinosaurs is because there was no word dinosaur back then, okay? We've only known about dinosaurs since about the 19th century. I mean, there was at one point, and let me see, I want to get the name of this guy right, because it was actually a pastor. It was the first person to identify them. And see, do I have it here? Okay, so the King James Bible was first published in the early 17th century. That was 200 years before anyone in the Western world knew about dinosaurs. In the 19th century, we had a paleontologist and theologian named William Buckland, who became the first naturalist to correctly identify dinosaur fossils as belonging to these ancient reptiles. And even then, he didn't call them dinosaurs. Okay, that came a few decades later with another English paleontologist named Richard Owen, who combined the Greek words deinos, meaning great, and sauros, meaning reptile, doing exactly what Genesis did, great reptiles. And so they didn't know about dinosaurs back then. I think it is entirely reasonable to look at this passage and to say that it was referring to dinosaurs and large aquatic reptiles. Okay, along with every particular species of living thing that crawls. And now, when you read this passage, you have to remember that in this context, it's kind of watery. I think it's still in the context of things in the ocean. Now, we know that there's tons of animal life that crawls on the surface of the earth, but what I didn't appreciate before I researched this book is that there is a great diversity of crawling aquatic life, and you guys will be familiar with a lot of this. Crustaceans like crab, lobster, shrimp, mollusks, echinoderms, things like sea urchins and sea cucumbers, sponges and worms. There's a huge diversity of things down there, tens of thousands of known species in these groups. And the phyla, the basic body plans for all of these things, showed up in the Cambrian explosion. So it's telling us there's a lot of stuff crawling around down there, and there really is. Every particular species of winged flying creature. Again, remember, it's not literally saying birds. Anything that has wings and flies. There are 4 major groups of flying animals, and these appear at some point in the history of the earth. Insects, pterosaurs, which, like these aquatic reptiles, are not technically dinosaurs, although they appeared at the same time. We're thinking of things like pterodactyls, birds, and bats. Now, what I didn't appreciate, and I think I'm speaking to the right audience here in Austin, is just how important bats are in terms of the ecology of the earth. They really are. I did not know this until I looked it up. So they are the only flying mammals on earth, like literally flying. We have flying squirrels, but they don't actually fly. They glide. Okay, they represent one of the largest mammal groups in existence today. There are a lot of them here in Austin. They play a similar ecological role throughout most of the world as birds. And of course, they echolocate. Now, the importance of all flying creatures, birds, insects, and bats, is that they pollination. They carry out quite a bit of pollination, which is extremely important for flowering plants for food. Okay. And bats also, thankfully for us, help to control the insect population around the world. Okay, so they are very important. The Bible isn't wasting time on things that aren't important. These are all very important. I didn't appreciate them until I started looking into it. Genesis 1:22, God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and become many and fill the waters of the seas." Well, gosh, there are over 1 million known species of marine life on Earth, and potentially many more that we just haven't discovered. They really did become fruitful and many. Let the flying creatures multiply on the land. Well, there is a huge, again, abundance and diversity of airborne life on Earth. Genesis 1:24. We're getting towards the end of the list here. God said, "The earth shall bring forth particular species of living creatures, particular species of livestock, land animals, and beasts of the earth." Okay, so I think most of us are aware that scientifically speaking, it's pretty certain that there was a catastrophic event that wiped out the dinosaurs. We think probably the Chicxulub asteroid that made that enormous crater that forms the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so wiped out the dinosaurs. Now, mammals coexisted with dinosaurs at that time. They just were not the dominant form of life. Once the dinosaurs were gone, these small mammals came to dominate the surface of the earth. These quickly diversified into animals that we would recognize today, and especially animals that have become of interest to humankind, like livestock. And this is, again, rather important. If you read Hugh Ross's book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, he talks about how extremely important animals have been to the development of human beings, particularly of livestock. And I think anybody here who grew up on a farm or knows someone who did or has worked with animals understands how important the co-development of humans with animals has been. God said, here we go. Now we're getting, this is the crowning achievement of Genesis here. Let us make man with our image and likeness. Okay, so we know that mankind, human beings, were latecomers to the scene, right? In terms of all of the life that has gradually developed over time on Earth. Okay, so this is the main feature of Genesis, and again, there's some interesting stuff here. So what confuses people is the language here. Now God is using the plural. Let us make man with our image and likeness. And there's been a lot of theological debate over why this language is used. You know, is it like the royal we? Some people have posited that. I don't think that is likely. And so here again, I'm going to refer to the Living Torah, which is considered to be one of the most reliable English translations of Genesis. And it draws on the wisdom again of Nachmanides, this medieval biblical scholar. There have been lots and lots of biblical scholars over the years, but history has distilled them down to 3 or 4 of the most important, reliable ones, and Nachmanides is one of those. After I read Gerald Schroeder's book, I actually went out and bought Nachmanides' commentary just on Genesis. It's this thick, just his commentary on one book. It's incredible. Okay, so he had a lot to say. So, referring to this passage regarding let us, he tells us, God was speaking to all the forces of creation that he had brought into existence, Now that all the ingredients of creation had essentially been completed, all would participate in the creation of man, the crown of creation. So it continues with an explanation of the phrase, with our image and likeness, okay, which we've got here, which is inferred to mean that the humans are thus a microcosm of all the forces of creation. So Genesis states very clearly that the bodies of humans and animals are made of the same earthly material, literally the dust of the earth. All of the stuff in your body, this is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, this all came from literally the dirt of the earth, okay, right? So we're made of earthly material, but we're more than just animated matter. I think even atheists get that sense there's something more there, right? But Christians, we understand that it is the human spirit, and it is that spiritual aspect that is the image of God. We're in the physical image of the earth, we are in the spiritual image of God. And humans who possess the unique combination of being dual physical and spiritual, meaning God's spirit in nature, and this is when we appear. Now, when I began to write this, the commentary on this part, it just goes on for pages and pages. There is a lot to be said about this because there are many different words that refer to spirit and soul. I'm not going to go into that here, but there's quite a bit. But I think it's very clear here that it's talking about God and all the forces of creation that he developed in the earth together creating humankind. God thus created man with his image. In the image of God, he made them. And I think this is important here because at some point in the development of hominids, this means any creature that looks like a human being, we acquired the mysterious quality of consciousness, and it is a very mysterious quality. Nobody has really, in naturalistic terms, been able to explain what consciousness is, where it came from. It is a great mystery in science. There's an author named Julian Jaynes, who I recommend if you're at all interested in this, and he talks about the origin of consciousness and how you can tell when it happened. We have it, and I believe that this is the unique quality that we get from God. Okay. Genesis 1:28, God said to them, be fertile and become many, fill the land and conquer it, dominate the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every beast that walks the land. So if you look at the estimates, I looked this up once, how many human beings total have ever lived? There are some scientific estimates that it's as much as 100 billion. I'm not sure if it's that high, but we know for sure that it has been several billions, a lot of people, okay? We certainly have become fertile and many. We have absolutely come to dominate the earth in a way that no other life form has. That is without question. Now, what I want to point out here, this is, you actually just witnessed the miracle, and I'm going to explain it to you. That is the proof. And now we'll just go through the details. So this quote here, Bronze Age desert tribesmen, is referring to Moses and his people. This is how Richard Dawkins referred to them. And then it got changed, as people call Bronze Age goat herders. Now, I love that he trivializes them this way. I love that he kind of puts them down in this derogatory way. Because the point he's trying to make is, why are you going to trust a book that was written by a bunch of Bronze Age dusty guys out in the desert, right? I love that he put it that way because it works totally against him and it works for us. So here's the question to ask yourself. How did these Bronze Age, mostly illiterate desert tribesmen, how did they know the universe was created? Now we take it for granted now because we've all heard of the Big Bang Theory. We've all heard of this. The universe is 14 billion years old, right? They didn't know that. And in fact, Aristotle, he said the universe is eternal. It would be natural to look around and see things in human lifetimes don't change, really. To look at the universe and to say, yeah, it's always been here, right? And for thousands of years, people believed that the universe was eternal. How did these people think it wasn't? How did they know that it was developed gradually? Let's say, okay, so somehow they knew the universe was created. How did they know that it progressed in a stepwise way? I can imagine that if I didn't know anything about God, if I was some, thousands years in, before Christ, and I'm just some dusty desert person, I would just think that, okay, if somebody did bring the universe into existence, would do it like that. Just a turnkey thing, here you go, boom, universe, good to go. Why would anyone think that it was developed gradually, right? How did they know the major events? Okay, this took us hundreds of years and billions of dollars of scientific grants to figure out. How did these guys figure out the major events? My goodness. How did they know? And how did they get them in the right order? And this is where the miracle really occurs. So this is something that I especially, I get so frustrated when I talk to atheists about this, and I'll say, look, the fact that they got the order, they figured out the events. Yeah, but these two things look like they're out of order. It's like, are you kidding me? It's like finding a document thousands of years ago that's talking about, quantum field theory. And says, well, but I got that symbol wrong. Oh my gosh, are you kidding me? So the fact that they knew all of this stuff, Bronze Age goat herders, right? Okay, what kind of person actually knows these things? This kind of person, a professor, a scientist, right? I don't know who he is. I just looked up a picture of a professor and he looked really professorial. So this guy knows, maybe. But like me, he'd have to look most of it up. I needed a crib sheet just to remember all this stuff. And I've been doing this for years, right? Okay. This is the kind of person you would expect to know. And he'd have a whole library of books at home that he would refer to. So let's look at the possible explanations for how this guy knew all this stuff. Okay, they just guessed correctly. Moses and his people somehow they just guessed, okay? They had access to advanced scientific knowledge that somehow has been lost over the millennia. Maybe they had scientific labs, or maybe they were able to figure out this stuff out in a way that's more clever than we did with all of our equipment to the scientists, okay? Maybe advanced extraterrestrials came to Earth and gave them this information. Or maybe this information was divinely revealed to them. So these are the only 4 possibilities that I can think of for how they were able to come up with something as incredible and miraculous as Genesis 1. Okay, let's look at this. So let's start with number 2. If these guys could get it right thousands of years ago, why did we need to spend all this time and money and expertise relearning it all? Seriously, I mean, does anybody think that these people were running experiments and digging up fossils and doing all that? How would they possibly know, right? I need multi-million-dollar equipment to do the research that I do to discover some of the things that we talked about. I think we can just rule that out. Did extraterrestrials visit Bronze Age Earth? Okay, well, there's no record of this at all. I mean, there's nothing in Scripture said these strange men came to us and told us these things, and then off they went, to the sky. Nothing like that. The existence of extraterrestrials itself is very unlikely. I know that it seems almost inevitable to people if you consider that there are hundreds of billions of stars in each galaxy, and there's hundreds of billions of galaxies in this vast universe. But if you look at mathematically all of the parameters that have to be in place in order for advanced life to develop, it just wipes that out. It is so unlikely that life would just randomly develop elsewhere in the universe. But even if they did, we know that long distance space travel is really impractical. I mean, look how long it took us just to get to the moon, months to get to Mars. It would take years and years and years, lifetimes to get to the next star. Okay, there could be some technology that would allow people to get a certain distance that would be incredibly speculative, but Hugh Ross points this out, that this is the time period, this is how long it takes for advanced life to show up in the universe. So even if you had advanced extraterrestrials developing, getting in their spaceships and making the long journey here, it's not going to work, because the time it would take them to get here, generations and generations and generations of them, why would they even come to this star, to this planet? But that doesn't give enough time in the past for them to have developed, to have gotten to that point of being advanced and technologically able to do this. So we can rule that out. And even if all of that could happen, why would they just plop down on Earth and say, hey guys, here's a little bit of scientific info, we gotta go. And just, that would be, why? I mean, why wouldn't they give them more practical information? Here's an internal combustion engine. Here, you guys can, invent a car now. Why would they give them just this information and then leave? I mean, none of that makes sense. It is extremely, to me, is a terrible explanation. Okay, so we've gotten rid of that one. We've gotten rid of that one. So we've got two left. Let's talk about proposition number one that they just somehow guessed correctly. Okay, so we've got to look at the odds. We've got 27 events. And it's not a given that even if, it's just a miracle that they knew these events in the first place, right? But let's say that you wrote each one of these events on a slip of paper. And then you just toss these into a basket and just say, okay, you guys, pull them out in the right order, just by chance. So this is the odds of guessing the correct order of all of these events, okay? So let's just say, for instance, that we start with 5 slips of paper. If I had 5 slips of paper and I wrote the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on separate pieces of paper, let's look at the odds that you would pick all 5 up in the correct order, going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The odds of getting the first one right would just be 1 out of 5. You've got 5 slips of paper. The odds are 1 in 5 that you get the first one correct, okay? The next one, now let's say you picked up the first one in the correct order. You picked up slip number 1. Now you've got to pick up slip number 2. Your odds are now 1 out of 4 because there's only 4 slips of paper left. And the way that probabilities work is that if you're looking at the probability of 2 events occurring, getting the first 2 slips in order, you multiply the probabilities together. So in this case, getting 1 and then number 2 in that order would be, the odds would be 1 out of 20. Okay, so you keep doing this and you get what's called 1 over 5 factorial. So for you math geeks out there, we're not saying 1 out of 5. That's just a way of mathematicians just shorthand, because people in math and science were lazy. We don't want to write out 1 over 5 times 1 over 4. Blah, blah, blah. That 5 with the exclamation mark, that means factorial. It means just 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So anytime you see that, it just means that number divided or multiplied by everything that came before it. Okay, so those odds turn out to be 120 to 1. Not great, but it could happen. Realistically, you'd have to do it about 100 times before you'd expect to actually get that right. Okay, but all right. Now, what if you have 10 slips of paper that you're trying to pick up in the right order randomly? They're all turned over, you can't see them. You got to just pick them up in the right order. Now, I think people kind of naively would look at this and think, well, it's probably just double that, right? Well, no, remember, you're multiplying 10 times 9 times 8, The odds are not in your favor, really not in your favor. 3.6 million to 1, okay? You'd have to do this experiment over 3 million times before you could realistically expect to do it correctly. Not great, okay? We're starting to get up to lottery numbers. Now, we're talking about 27 slips of paper here with Genesis. These 27, just never mind the fact that these people figured out what the events were. Now they have to piece them together in the right order. Are you guys ready for this? Okay, so that notation, for those of you who aren't nerds, that's an exponential notation. That means a 1. So 1 times 10 to the power of 28. That 10 to the 28 means a 1 followed by 28 zeros. Again, math and science people are lazy. We don't want to write out 28 zeros. So we go 10, 28 times. Okay, that's what that means, except I am going to write it out. That's what that looks like. Those are the odds of somebody getting 27 events, sequential events, just randomly, just by guessing in the right order. Okay, this is going to form the basis of the miracle here. You are over 400 times more likely to win the Powerball jackpot 3 times in a row than you are to pick up those 27 slips of paper in the right order, okay? So this is as close to impossible as it gets. The odds aren't exactly equal to 0, but they might as well be. You would have to have so many lifetimes of the universe of people just picking up slips of paper over and over and over. We're talking far longer than the universe will ever exist, okay? I think we can safely say that we can rule out guessing. If they were able to guess that, that would be a bigger miracle than anything I can possibly think of. So this leaves, when you've ruled out things that it can't possibly be, okay, you're left with one thing that we have to take seriously, which is that this information was divinely revealed to them. Okay, so going back to this poor guy here. Now, the reason that they knew he was guilty is the fact that this $16 million lottery ticket and access to the lottery system both pointed to the same guy. So that's how they knew this guy was guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. Now, this is a high standard when you're talking about, we're not talking about civil cases where it's a preponderance of evidence. We're talking about a criminal case where there's no room for doubt whatsoever. This guy is guilty. And the numbers alone were enough for 2 juries to convict this guy, okay? That's it. So if we do something similar, here's Moses, right? Bronze Age desert tribesman. He's in possession of 3 Powerball jackpot tickets and then some, right? Effectively. And I know they didn't have actual codex books back then, but he had Genesis, right? That's his 3 times Powerball ticket. Well, we therefore infer from that he had access to the system. That's the only explanation that makes sense for how he could have gotten Genesis right. Okay, that's the inference we make. It's not that these 2 things point to Moses, it's that these 2 things point to that, okay? We can therefore infer beyond any reasonable doubt that he had access to the system, okay, by the person who did this, the person who is the system, okay? So the best explanation is that this information was divinely revealed to them. And this is the level, to me, of just proof, okay? The odds are so absurd that for me, it removed any doubt whatsoever. And I have to point out that when I was looking into this and when I was reading about all of this, I was sort of vaguely a God believer, but I did not believe in the God of the Bible. I didn't believe in Jesus Christ at this point. I was a graduate student. I was looking into this. I had been convinced that there must be a God of some sort by looking at my research. This makes too much sense to be an accident. But when I started actually reading the Bible, because I wanted to figure out, okay, if I believe in God, who is God? I look at the Bible, I start to read the New Testament, I look at this, and it's like, there's no question to me that Genesis is literally true, that it was written by God, given to a mortal human. The odds just as decided. And I went through the numbers over and over and over because I'm naturally a skeptical person. And I was like, no. There was no other explanation, okay? So to me, this is proof. This is as rock solid proof for anything that you will ever get, okay? Now the question is, okay, before I get to this, so I've talked to people about this, skeptics, believers, seekers, and for a lot of them, it really shakes them. Like they don't know what to do with this, and then they'll just ask, well, why is this proof only available to us now? Why did it take millennia, centuries, of investigation, of science, giant telescopes and particle colliders to figure this out? Why is it just available to us now? Well, and I have an explanation for that. And so, talking about a book, so I'm a huge Tolkien geek. I love The Lord of the Rings. I'm super into the lore. I read the book for the first time when I was 15 years old. And you have a certain perspective on life when you're 15, a certain maturity level, a certain intellectual level. And when I first read it, those of you who read it, it's a great story, right? Just in and of itself, it's a great adventure story. I loved it. But when I went back and I read it years later, and I put myself on a 5-year rule, I'm only allowed to read it every 5 years. Otherwise, I think I would just overconsume it because I love it that much. And so I read it again 5 years later, and then 5 years later again, and each time the book revealed something new to me. It became deeper. I've discovered, and especially after I became Christian. And wow, did that open my eyes to so much deep theology that is in this book, in which, if you're not familiar with that, there's a great book written by a professor named Ralph Woods called The Gospel According to Tolkien, and he points out once you see it, very obvious Christian theology that is just throughout this whole book, but just the depth of it, right? And you're able to see more. You unlock new layers in a great work. Every time you read it, when you become older, wiser, more experienced, you know more, right? Your perspective changes. And so I think it is true collectively for us as a human species when we read Scripture. Okay, so there are many layers to Scripture. I'm sure many of you have studied books of the Bible over and over, and each time you do, it's like, how did I not see that before? You see something new, something you experience in your life allows you to relate to it in a different way. Well, it's like that with Genesis. And I believe that layers of meaning in Scripture become apparent to us both as individuals and as a human species when they are needed. Okay, so I think the proofs for claims in the Bible match the information level of a society. There was a time when the vast majority of people in the Western world were Christian, okay? The level of proof matched the level of skepticism and information that people had. They didn't need this information because they weren't an information, scientific, technology-driven society. But now that we are, we've now unlocked a new layer of meaning in the Bible, especially of Genesis, that allows us to understand that. So each time we find a new way to be skeptical, Scripture presents us with a new way of understanding it and a way to relate to it. And that is because the Bible is a God-breathed living document. It is amazing every time I read it how alive it is in that regard. So that's why this proof is available to us now, because we need it. Now, there's a practical benefit to this. So it's not just that, okay, so great, we believe it. And I talked in my previous lecture about what would you do with this proof if you had it? How would you live your life differently? What would you change? But also it can be very practical in the sense that, I don't know if many of you can relate to this. I have struggled with terrible depression in my life, horrible. There was a time a few years ago where I just went through a very deep, deep, dark depression. It was kicked off by postpartum depression, and then it just piled. I had a terrible time. I had cancer 3 times. My husband almost died. Terrible postpartum depression. We lost a child. And after that, there's only so much a person can take. And I plunged into a really deep, terrible depression. And for those of you who've been there, and I'm so sorry that you've experienced this because it's awful, when it goes on and on and on, you're tempted to reach that level of despair to say, can God exist if I'm living in this much pain? I mean, it's not rational, but it's understandable, right? And I actually began to doubt. It's like, can God even exist if there's this much pain and it won't stop? And I actually literally went back to this part of the book that I had written, to this Genesis mathematical argument, and of course, God is real. Of course he is. And it brought me back to faith. It was my lifeline. It was the hand that was reaching through the darkness of God saying to me, yes, I'm real, and I'm here with you. It was such a strong proof to me that it was able to pierce through that darkness, that absolute depth of darkness, because I knew beyond any doubt through this miracle of the mathematics of Genesis that God is real. And it was something that allowed me to just cling to hope. And you kind of just start to climb up that rope, and I eventually got out of that depression. But it has a practical purpose, it can really be helpful. Okay, so why does the Bible begin with Genesis 1? This is another question I get. Well, for one thing, it establishes God's absolute sovereignty over all of creation. Because as many clever atheists know, if you can ridicule Genesis, if you can knock it down, if you can prove that it's just a ridiculous false document, then that's it. The rest of what comes in the Bible doesn't matter. You have to establish God's absolute sovereignty over everything, because from that comes all of the other important stuff in Scripture. You can trust it, and God has the sovereignty to do all of these things, right? It establishes the trustworthiness of Scripture also. If your opening part of the Bible is something that is, bam, establishes a miracle like that, well, for me, I looked at that, and that allowed me to confidently move from the Old Testament to the New. So I'm working through the OT, right? I'm reading these books and like, wow, this is amazing. And I also starting to match up like these prophecies and, how these prophecies came true. And it's like, wow, the Old Testament is amazing. And because of that, it's like, well, there's a whole other testament here. I need to move on to the New Testament. And this is what propelled me to keep going. Okay, and to start reading the New Testament eventually led me to Jesus Christ. And this is when I talk about, what led me to the cross. And of course, I investigated all of these claims all along the way. I'm not saying because Genesis is true, therefore the New Testament is true. The New Testament stands on its own evidence. There's a lot of evidence to support the New Testament, but it led me there. There's a direct path from the trustworthiness of Genesis 1 for me all the way to the cross. Okay, I want to finish out with this wonderful quote by Werner Heisenberg. If any of you know, he is a father of quantum physics, a very important figure in physics. So this is attributed, so his protege Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker is the one who said that Heisenberg said this. According to an old phrase, the first sip from the cup of knowledge separates us from God. But at the bottom of the cup, God is waiting for the one who seeks him. If so, then there is a way of thinking that leads to religious truths, and to seek only that way is rewarding. If it is not so, our world will put its hopes to religion in vain. I think this is a wonderful quote, and this is so like the experience of many people, especially when they're younger, and maybe they're raised in the church, or like me, raised without religion at all. And you start to learn a little bit about the world. You learn a little bit of physics, a little bit of biology, and you're just like, oh no, this is a better explanation for everything than God. I don't need God. That's that first sip, right? But the deeper you go into it, the more it brings you back. And by the time you get to the bottom of that glass, there you are, face to face with God. And he's saying that this is a way of thinking that leads to religious truth. He was a very devoted Christian man and one of the most important figures in modern physics. And for me to see quotes like that, especially when I was a new Christian, it really bolstered my faith. But this is exactly what we're talking about here. Okay, and one final lesson that I want you all to get from this, and I know I'm speaking to the right crowd, that this is one reason to not shy away from learning science, and especially from teaching your children and your grandchildren science. I know a lot of Christians understandably are very worried about science carrying their children away from Jesus, which as a mother, I totally relate to that. My one sole true purpose I feel with raising my child is to make her, at least to inspire her to pursue God, to pursue Jesus all the days of her life. And I believe that science is incredibly supportive of that if you approach it the right way. So thank you all very much for coming out today and listening to me.
Yes, perfect. Excellent. So hopefully we have time for Q&A.
Yeah,
hopefully.
absolutely.
So, real quick, with the Q&A, we do have two rules. First rule is that, let me say, first of all, we'll have two microphones. David's holding the microphone. And Rich, maybe, is there another microphone over there? If you have a question, raise your hand so that one of them can bring the microphone to you. When you do have the microphone, we do ask that you ask a question, that you aren't one of those people that go on and on and on telling us what you think about the subject. Okay, we're all waiting for that question. Don't be that person. If you need to set up your question with a little bit of commentary, that's fine, but please keep it short so that we can get through a lot of questions and everybody will have an opportunity. So that's the first rule. Second rule, I'm the president. I get to ask the questions. So, Sarah, you never disappoint. That was so fantastic and very thought-provoking. So you refer to Dawkins, and Dawkins defines faith as a belief without any evidence or in spite of the evidence. He likes to make a little straw man definition of the word faith there. You would be an example, a counterexample of that, and that the evidence brought you to the faith. So here's the question, because a lot of people say that it doesn't matter what the evidence is, you're going to believe what you want to believe. People are going to have faith regardless of the evidence. Is there any future discovery that you think could undermine your faith, that would potentially cause you to question the faith?
That's a question I get asked often, especially on social media. I'm very active on X, used to be known as Twitter, and that's something that I get from my skeptical followers. Now, as far as belief in God, and I might sound like an ideologue here, honestly, there's no evidence that would ever convince me that God doesn't exist, because it's like, you might as well ask me, is there any evidence you could present to me that I don't exist? You know, it's just, to me, it is so factual, because I exist. I am not the explanation for my own existence. If I was, then I would be God, which I am not, but something has to exist apart from me that is the explanation for my existence. So even if I'm a brain in a vat somewhere, even if I'm just some disembodied mind and I'm hallucinating this whole experience, I can't disprove that that's happening. But I know that thought is occurring, therefore thought exists. Something had to be there to create that environment for thought to exist. God is the explanation for that. So to me, without a doubt, God exists. Now, the only way that you could prove to me that it is not the God of the Bible is that you would have to somehow prove to me that I'm a brain in a vat, because the evidence is so overwhelming to me. First of all, this, you're never going to convince me that this is not proof for God. This is so rock solid that it's there. To convince me otherwise, you'd have to tell me that I've hallucinated all of this, that this is all made up, I'm in the Matrix, this is some alternate reality. Honestly, that's what it would take. Now, what you can quibble about, and this is a stumbling block for a lot of people, is whether or not God cares, right? And this is why it ultimately comes at, even with every atheist I've ever talked to, when I can lead them to the point that rationally they can believe, okay, maybe there's a deistic sort of God. I can't believe that he cares at all for these tiny little ants that are human beings on this rock in a vast universe. That's a whole different discussion. That's a great discussion to have with someone. If you can use stuff like this to get someone to the point of saying, okay, sure, God exists. He doesn't care. Oh, then you have a whole discussion about Jesus Christ, right? Right there. The God who died for you on the cross. Then you have that discussion. But yeah, I'm totally dialed in at this point.
Excellent. Okay, so right here first, and then back there second.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's really interesting. I had a question about your analogy of picking up 27 numbers out of a bucket. I guess my question is, even though they were like Bronze Age tribesmen, I guess they weren't totally randomly picking 27 numbers. Right? They had their own observation of the universe, their own, although maybe primitive our time ideas of how things work. And I was thinking like, yeah, well maybe if I was in their shoes and I was trying to guess the order of how the universe came to be, I probably would choose things like, oh yeah, light came first and matter, probably time that, then I would just based on the complexity of those things, or how primitive or how basic it seemed to be just in day-to-day life. And so I was curious, maybe I'm biased because we have this knowledge and therefore I'm thinking, okay, that should be obvious. Maybe are you familiar with any other traditions or religious creation stories?
I've read the Enuma Elish, which is very interesting. It's the Babylonian creation myth, and some of the others. Yeah, they're very interesting.
I guess I was interested to know, were they kind of accurate too? Because then we kind of gauge, okay, with that kind of primitive knowledge, how close can you get just by guessing? Versus like, if they're totally off, then it would be like, oh yeah, then those, then Moses had something going there, and that he was able to, even with that primitive knowledge, get something so accurate.
Right. Great question, and it's something that people do come up with in the context of this argument, which is a legitimate thing to ask. Now, one thing that you have to separate yourself from, it's really hard to do because we are absolutely steeped in scientific knowledge in this culture, right? We grew up with it. It's really hard to separate ourselves from that. To imagine growing up somewhere completely isolated from all modern knowledge, what would your perspective be? And I had this discussion with my dad. And so, you could say, okay, they might say, okay, water had to come first before marine life, right? But he said, think about this, because he, for his graduate work, studied human behavior, and quite often he would teach his students about like the primitive tribesmen in Papua New Guinea and things like this to give perspective. And he said, no, they don't necessarily think like that. You could get this idea of God first created fish, and then he realized he needed a home for them. So then he created the water and put the fish in the water, right? We're just assuming that they're going to think the way we do because we grew up learning these things as early as possible. Before we can even speak, we're learning these things, right? So it's not a given that they think like God created the world and he saw that it was dark and then he created light, right? So I think it's so hard to shift our perspective to one that is not steeped in all of the scientific knowledge. And it's a totally different way of thinking. Now, even if you could connect certain things like you need water before you have marine life, right? Even if you did that only reduces the odds a little bit. So you still have to take, okay, marine life, where does it go? It's not a given. If you didn't know that life would begin in the water, they said it could begin in the sky and it fell to the earth, right? You don't know. So while I think that's a very reasonable question, and it's hard to take ourselves out of this scientific context, I think honestly, and if you look, it's kind of hard to compare with these other creation myths because they're so different. I encourage you all to read through something like the Enuma Elish, especially because there have been accusations that whoever wrote Genesis cribbed from it because it's the Babylonian creation myth. Gosh, they could not be more different. They posited the creation, first you have these gods and monsters and they went to war with each other and they're ripping their bodies apart, and it's a kind of a combination of the blood that dripped out of this monster and mixed with mud to create humans, and it's like, how do you compare them? It's hard to draw a direct comparison. So anyway, that's my take on it. I hope that helped.
Thank you, in the back there. Yes, go ahead.
I am an engineer by education, so I have had good basic science up through the early part of college, but it's been a long time, so I don't remember a lot of specifics. And one of the things that occurred to me when we were talking early on about the energy, the instant after the Big Bang, or however long it was before matter was energy, and then my brain immediately I realized it always clicks to the electromagnetic spectrum as energy. And of course, there's other forms of energy like kinetic energy, potential energy, chemical energy. But can you expand a little bit more on what that energy really was? And then as a second part of the question is, how did that become this plasma of quarks and gluons? What process was that? Because that's way beyond anything I ever learned when I was.
Okay, yeah, great question. And I think the answer to that is we're not entirely sure what the process is. I am not a particle physicist. I'm an astrophysicist who studies black holes, distant black holes. But what I understand is we don't exactly know what is the process. So for instance, you get, and we've observed this happening, you get a particle and an antiparticle, like a positron and an electron. They're the same mass, but they have opposite charge. When they meet each other, they annihilate and they produce a gamma ray, which is just energy. It's a photon, really high energy photon. The process of that, I have no idea. I have no idea how you transform two masses and create a burst of energy. I don't know. And the other side of the coin, I don't know how you end up with energy and how you get a particle arising from that. So one idea is that you've got this 0 point energy in the universe. It's this quantum kind of bubbling at the quantum level, and especially around black holes. So very near the black holes, you've got extreme gravity. So you've got weird things going on, and you can get what are called virtual particles just popping out of that vacuum energy there. And if one of these virtual particles goes into the black hole, the other one becomes a real particle and zips off. I don't think anybody understands the process by which that happens. We just know that it can, and that it is accounted for by E equals mc squared. So what we do know is that you've got this energy, this leftover energy from the Big Bang. So you can think of like, and that's a really good question because there are different types of energy. There's mechanical energy, but what we're talking about is just like the temperature, just these photons, right? This leftover energy from the Big Bang in the form of photons. These are just little energy packets, right? But the universe is so incredibly hot just after the Big Bang that you cannot have the formation of stable matter. So for a while there you had it kind of go matter, energy, matter, energy, matter, energy, and you have at one point, I can talk to you technically because you're an engineer, what's called freeze out, okay? And this is a point where it gets cold enough, it's still ridiculously hot, millions and millions of degrees, but it gets cold enough that you can get matter finally forming and not annihilating with itself. This is where you get quarks and gluons forming. You get this quark-gluon soup, okay? The superfluid, stable matter forms, and as the universe expands, and you know the principle of refrigeration, right? When you expand a fluid, it cools down. And so this is how the universe cools down, the universe expands, and then you get more stable forms of matter forming. So that's the best I can do. I wish I knew the mechanism. I don't. It's a big mystery.
So I just realized in my introduction that I failed to mention that you are an astrophysicist.
Yes.
And a professor, a lecturer, University of Texas and also Southwestern University. Right?
Yeah, I was at UT for 16 years. I quit in 2017 to focus on other things, but I am still up at Southwestern, yeah.
Okay, very qualified, yes.
So, excellent, because I actually have a couple astrophysics questions.
All right.
You, in your talk, you mentioned the asteroid that took out the dinosaurs. So the first question is, how'd that happen in the presence of Jupiter? And the second question is, when you look at Revelation, it talks about 1/3 of the sun, 1/3 of the moon, 1/3 of the earth being destroyed. Does that resonate with something that would happen based on your understanding of astrophysics?
Okay, let me take the first one. So the asteroid. So the funny thing is, Jupiter has this wonderful reputation as being kind of a shepherd and a guardian of the earth, but what lately astrophysics are kind of changing their mind a little bit on this, but that Jupiter can also be kind of a gravitational accelerator that will fling asteroids at us occasionally. So you had an earlier period, so very early on you had this period of what's called bombardment. There's just so much debris left over from the formation of the solar system that you just look at the surface of the moon, it's just, that's from that period of bombardment, right? Just a lot of stuff floating around, and it's going to, over hundreds of millions of years, it's going to strike the Earth, it's going to strike the moon, all these other things. That slows down eventually as these orbital paths, things orbiting around the sun start to clear out their orbital paths. This stuff either gets kind of blown away or it gets swept up into other bodies and congeals, right? And so at some point, these events just become a lot less frequent. But yeah, it was just sort of a random freak event that happened, and it may well have been accelerated by Jupiter. So Jupiter can be protective, but it can also, according to a new mathematical way of looking at this, it can occasionally fling things our way. And then the second part of your question, you were talking about Revelation.
Yeah, it talks about how 1/3 of the, thank you, how 1/3 of the sun will disappear, 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of life on Earth. And I was thinking about that from perhaps an asteroid event or something like that, or maybe the resonance between Mercury and Jupiter. Can you visualize some things that would explain that from a cosmos standpoint?
It's possible. I'm not sure exactly what. That's one thing that we've learned about God, is that whatever we think he's going to do, he's going to probably surprise us with how he does it. And the other thing we know about God is that whenever he has interacted with human beings in Scripture, it is always through some natural appearing phenomenon, like a burning bush. He doesn't just walk up to Moses and start talking to him. There's a burning bush that draws his attention, and there's a voice that comes from it. You know, the column of fire, the column of cloud that leads the Israelites through the desert, that kind of thing. You know, occasionally you do have an angel of the Lord appearing, but mostly we have God speaking to us and interacting with us through natural appearing phenomena. So my guess, and it's really just a guess, is whatever he chooses as the methods for fulfilling the prophecies in Revelation will be kind of natural looking, would be my guess, but probably very extraordinary.
I would also caution in regard to Revelation that it's
Very symbolic.
And it's popular literature, which is highly symbolic.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have to be really cautious.
Yes.
Literally like that. Okay.
Thanks. This has to be important because Paul brings up it somehow straightened his mind out that things are made of what aren't seen. You know, he put that as it seemed like a non sequitur to a really tough question. Is by faith we believe that this is made of stuff we don't know what it is. But I had a question about how Christians react to one thing you said, and also just a question, something I have never heard preached on, but it could, if you thought it was legit, it could be added to your repertoire there with Genesis. But how do Christians react when you don't use the fact that, you know, we or Elohim or whatever it is, we made this, and you put it toward the use of previous life forms made man, and I know we supposedly contain cells that were other structures, and we're made, we owe all the previous life forms. Well, when you turn it that way and you don't use it as an apologetic for God being three parts, you completely cut out somebody else's reason for believing God based on Genesis. And then the second one is...
if you don't mind, I'll address the first one first, and then you can answer the second one, because my pea brain can't handle remembering these things. So, and I want to try to understand your first question. So you're asking, when I talk to other Christians, and I'm not sure I quite understood, if you could interpret for me.
So the verse where it said, "Let us make man in our image."
Yeah.
A lot of theologians believe that that's a reference to the Trinity.
Okay.
That, let us is a reference to Trinity, and our image is a reference to the Trinity, whereas you took that was God and the natural causation collectively.
Okay.
So what he's saying is that your interpretation may be counter to another Christian's interpretation. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And I would say either way you interpret it, it doesn't affect the aspect of how we count it in that numerical miracle, because if it's referring, and I'm fine either way. I haven't placed my bet on what "let us" means. I'm just trying to kind of figure it out. But whether it's referring to God and all the natural forces, or if it's referring to the Trinity or the divine council or what, it honestly doesn't matter at all for the point that I'm making here, that really it's just God and someone or something has made man, and man appears at that point. Yeah.
They're both good anyway. So. But the second one, I don't know what, I've never heard it, so, but it has, you can't really think of anything brand new, so maybe you've heard of it. But I got really mad when my mom said men get more genetic problems because they have less genetic matter because they got a Y chromosome, and y'all are missing something. Now, at that age, as an adolescent, I was not willing to hear anything bad about men, and I especially wasn't willing to hear anything bad about myself. So it made me incredibly mad for some reason. But now I feel like it's an apologetic to people that were Stone Age, Bronze Age people. Of course, every man has the same number of ribs as a woman, but could not God have been speaking of swiping the leg of the X chromosome? The woman's actually a more highly evolved and created and has a bigger genetic pool now, and so the man is actually missing something, and all the men here know all the jokes about it. So is that something you could weave in there?
So I think any good scientist has to admit his or her limitations, and I am not a biologist at all. I'm an astrophysicist, and so I'm always hesitant. I will never comment knowingly on something that's outside of my field and outside of my expertise. This is way outside of my, but I think it's interesting. I'll just say that. And Dr. Schroeder has some comments about what he thinks the rib is referring to. I think everybody kind of has their different speculations. That's honestly something I'm interested in. It doesn't trouble me. I think it's just an avenue for further study, and I think something will be revealed to us there. But that's an interesting point.
As someone who's not as educated on the subject, I can say men don't have less. So you just take that back.
I'm sorry.
Just
I'm here.
We're going to make this the last question. I'm very considerate of the time. We always advertise we end by 12, so LG.
And I'll have one thing to say at the end of the questions. Yeah.
Okay.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. So, I'm the vice president, so John makes me always ask the last question. I think because he thinks it's not going to be very good. So, I loved what you had to say, Sarah. Phenomenal presentation. Just one particular point. As you know, Hugh Ross, John Collins, Michael Strauss sort of look at this frame of reference view in the creation account of Genesis. And they put the frame of reference, you put the frame of reference on the surface of the earth when the waters were separated, right? They use, as you know, they put the frame of reference shift in the creation account prior to day one, where the Spirit of the Lord is hovering, brooding over the surface of the earth, right? You used some interpretation of Hebrew, and I just want to go back to that. And if you could explain to me why you put that change of perspective in that particular day of creation versus in that prior to the first day of creation, where RGB does, where John Collins does, and where Michael Strauss does. And does that have to do again with the Hebrew interpretation?
Okay, yeah. That's a great question. So there's a couple of responses to that. Now, there's a whole lot that comes before this that if I had 2 hours, I could do the full thing. So part of it is, as a physicist, I'm coming from a physicist kind of privileged position. There's like, oh, physics is supreme. So I'm looking at partly as a physicist and saying, well, these things sound very physicsy to me as opposed to geological and biological. And part of it also is because one thing that brought me to the Bible was Jerry Schroeder's explanation for how you reconcile 6 literal creation days with a universe that's billions of years old. And I can't remember if I've given that talk here, but I've given the talk many times. And I have a slideshow on my website about this, where you can use relativity, the relative nature of time, to pack 14 billion years from our perspective into the Genesis timeline, which is, Schroeder says, 6 literal 24-hour days, but strictly from God's perspective. Because in physics, this is something we have to do all the time. When we're talking about how long something takes or even the distance of something, you have to establish from whose perspective you're talking. Because in terms of relativity, we can have totally different experiences of the same event, okay? Different time, different distances. So from that perspective then, when you, and it's an exponential thing, each Genesis day lasts a different amount of time. So roughly speaking, the first Genesis day in this physics paradigm would be about 7 billion years. Then the next one would be half of that, 3.5, and then 1.75 billion years, And so what Schroeder does is he said, okay, given this timeline, let's match up what Genesis says with what science says happened at each of those time periods. And so that kind of naturally leads you to a more physics perspective that starts first with the universe as a big particle physics reactor and then moves to the Earth. And part of that is the Hebrew translation and interpretation. He relies a lot on the sages and what they say. And honestly, some of it just almost exploded my brain when I was reading it. Nachmanides, the things that he was saying sounded like a graduate level particle physics textbook. It was just like, this is incredible for something that's 700 years old. So there's that perspective. Now, that said, I also do find Hugh Ross's model compelling, where instead of starting with a particle physics paradigm, you're shifting almost immediately to the surface of the earth. And honestly, that works too. And those 27 statements still work. And so it's the kind of thing where it almost leads me to wonder, this is speculation, if Genesis is telling the same story, depending on what your primer is, how you're keyed into it. If you're keyed into it from an earth perspective, bam, you go straight to the surface of the earth. The earth is null and void, meaning that, yeah, it exists, but it's like Marty Pony has pointed out with his language, it means the surface is just laid waste. Like there's no structure, there's nothing there, right? It's just a water world, and then it develops. Honestly, this works both ways. You can kind of key in from the physics perspective and it tells one story, or you can key in from an earthly perspective and it's telling the first part of it a different story, but it all matches up once you for sure get to the surface of the earth, and it's talking about continents and seas and then life developing. But in my book, I'm actually going to present both because I think they're equally compelling. So.
You had one thing you wanted to say?
Yes, so I just want to point out for those of you who would like to continue to engage with me, I have a new website. It's on Substack. Substack is a really great way for me to reach a lot of people. I call it Schrodinger's Poodle, and I'm happy to talk to anybody afterwards about why I called it that. There's a whole story behind it, but this is it. So I'm going to give you guys something that you can use to link into it. So it is a website and it is a newsletter. Substack is great because it allows me to offer subscriptions to people. The vast majority of what I publish on there is freely available, but people also have the option to support me with a paid subscription, and then you get access to premium material. So you can use this to get to my Schrodinger's Poodle website if you want. You can also find me on formerly known as Twitter. I'm very active there. I just really enjoy engaging with people on social media and through my website, so I encourage you to go there if you're interested. Thank you again so much for coming out and for listening to me, and I'm happy to engage with you all.
Thank you, Sarah. So, in a televised debate, Dr. Ross was debating Kent Hovind. I don't know if you know Kent Hovind.
I actually saw that debate, yeah.
And I don't know if you remember in that debate, Dr. Ross was trying to make a point in regard to the Hebrew and the nuance in the Hebrew.
Yeah.
Kent said, well, I don't think someone needs to understand Hebrew to be able to read the Bible. And I thought,
somebody did, obviously, to turn it into English.
Right. I always think of that when somebody gets into the nuance in the Hebrew. It's very interesting.
Ouch.
So thank y'all so very much for coming.